A woman haunted by supernatural shadows on her land finds her life invaded by 10 men claiming to be marshals. When one reveals he is her cousin and the others are assassins, they must unite to uncover a terrifying family secret buried deep beneath the earth. Pursued by a ruthless corporation that wants to weaponize the darkness in their blood, they must risk everything to expose the truth to a world that won't believe them. A thrilling fusion of Western action and supernatural mystery. Subscribe and like for more epic tales from the frontier. The shadows came for Amelia at precisely 5:17 every evening. They weren't the natural kind, born from the setting sun. These were deeper, colder. They pooled in the corners of her porch, stretched long from the skeletal barn, and seemed to watch from the windows of the home she'd inherited but never felt was truly hers. 5 years she'd lived here since her grandmother's passing. 5 years of silence broken only by the whispering presence she called the shadows. They didn't harm her. They just waited. A constant, chilling reminder of a family legacy she didn't understand. Her fragile peace was shattered by the thunder of hooves. 10 riders, a ghostly procession against the bruised purple sky, emerged from the desert haze and reined in before her fence. They were hard men, dusted with trail grit, their faces carved from stone and hardship. Their leader, a man with a silver star badge pinned to a worn duster, tipped his hat. His eyes were as cold and dead as the shadows on her porch. "Amelia Blackwood?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. She nodded, her hand instinctively drifting toward the rifle leaning by the door. "We're U.S. Marshals. I'm Marshal Crow. We've been tracking a man. A dangerous man. We have reason to believe he might seek shelter here." Amelia's blood ran cold. "No one seeks shelter here. No one comes here at all." Crow's lips thinned into a humorless smile. "He might. This was his family's land once. A long time ago. His name is Silas Rook." The name meant nothing to her. She shook her head. "I don't know that name. This land was my grandmother's. It passed to me." The other marshals shifted in their saddles, their impatience palpable. The shadows around the property seemed to deepen, to coil. Crow studied her, then her house, his gaze lingering on the dark windows. He seemed to feel it too, the wrongness of the place. "Be that as it may, we'll need to search the property." She wanted to refuse, to protect her strange, haunted sanctuary from their intrusion. But the badges and the hard looks brooked no argument. She gave a stiff nod. They dismounted and fanned out, a well-oiled machine of men and violence. They searched the barn, the root cellar, the small bunkhouse. Amelia watched from the porch, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw them flinch as they entered dark spaces, saw them cross themselves when they thought no one was looking. They felt the shadows too. After 20 minutes, they regrouped, shaking their heads at Crow. Nothing. The marshal looked frustrated, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he could sense his quarry slipping away. "Very well," Crow said, mounting his horse. "We'll continue the search. You heed our warning, Miss Blackwood. If you see him, don't be a hero. He's a killer." He tipped his hat again. "Men, move out." 9 riders turned their horses and kicked up dust, heading back into the vast emptiness. But the 10th man, a figure who had hung back during the entire search, remained. He sat tall in the saddle, his face hidden by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He hadn't dismounted. He hadn't spoken a word. As the sound of the other marshals faded, the man nudged his horse forward until he was at the foot of her porch steps. Slowly, he reached up and tipped his hat back, revealing a face that was not cruel, but weary, with eyes that held a depth of sorrow that startled her. They were the exact same shade of stormy gray as her own. "I'm afraid I can't leave, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying a weight that felt like destiny. Amelia's breath caught. "What do you mean? The marshal told you to move out." The man shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not with them. My name is Silas Rook, and this isn't a social call. Those men aren't marshals. They're here to kill us both. And the only thing standing between us and them are the shadows at your door." Silas Rook just revealed the marshals are actually assassins. Why are they after him and Amelia? What is the true nature of the shadows that protect this land? And is Silas a dangerous killer or a wrongfully accused man? Share your theories in the comments below. The man's words kill us both hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the desert heat. Amelia's hand, which had been creeping toward her rifle, froze. The shadows on the porch seemed to stir, a subtle shift in the deepening twilight. That raised the hairs on her arms. "What are you talking about?" Amelia demanded, her voice tighter than she intended. "They were use marshals. I saw the badge." "A badge can be stolen. Or forged," Silas Rook said, his voice still low, his eyes constantly scanning the yard where the other riders had disappeared. "The real Marshal Crow and his men are dead. Buried in a shallow grave 2 days' ride from here. Those men are hired guns. Their leader's name is Deacon. And he's been paid a fortune to make sure the Blackwood line ends with you, and the Rook line ends with me." Amelia shook her head, a frantic denial. "The Blackwood line? I'm the last Blackwood. My grandmother was my aunt," Silas finished softly, his words a gentle but devastating earthquake that shattered her understanding of her own history. "My father was her brother. We are cousins, Amelia. This land, it belongs to both our families. It was never meant to be split." He slowly, carefully reached inside his coat. Amelia tensed, but he pulled out not a weapon, but a small, tarnished silver locket. He flipped it open and held it out. Inside was a faded daguerreotype of 2 children, a boy and a girl, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. They both had the same stormy gray eyes. "My father, Elias Rook," Silas sighed, pointing to the boy. "And your mother, Eleanor Blackwood." He looked up, his gaze piercing hers. "Siblings. The land was willed to them both. But after the trouble, my father fled. Your grandmother took your mother and claimed the land for herself, erasing our name from its history." Amelia stared at the locket, her mind reeling. Her mother had died when she was young. Her grandmother had never spoken of a brother, of cousins. It was a lie. Her entire life here was built on a foundation of omission. "What trouble?" Amelia whispered, the question tearing itself from her throat. Silas's face darkened. He nodded toward the gathering shadows. The shadows. They're not ghosts. They're a sickness, a curse, if you believe in such things. Our great-grandfather found something on this land. Something buried deep. It bleeds a kind of darkness. It infects the land, and it infects the bloodline. It brings out the worst in people: paranoia, greed, violence. It's why my father fled. He couldn't bear it. And it's why your grandmother became a recluse. She was trying to contain it." He took a step closer, his urgency palpable. "The men who just left Deacon and his crew, they weren't sent by the law. They were sent by the same corporation that our great-grandfather worked for, the one he stole that something from. They've been searching for generations. They found my father. They killed him for what he knew. And now they've found us. They believe we are the key to finding it because the land, the shadows, they respond to our blood." He finally looked directly at her, his expression one of shared, terrifying destiny. "They aren't just here to kill us, Amelia. They're here to use us as bait to lure the shadows, to find whatever is buried here. And then they'll burn this place to the ground, and us with it. Deacon isn't coming back with a warrant. He's coming back with torches and dynamite." As if on cue, a single distant gunshot echoed across the desert, a sharp crack that rolled over the silent land. It was a signal. The hunt was on. The shadows are a physical sickness from something buried on the land. A corporation is hunting both bloodlines to find it. What did their great-grandfather unearth? A mineral? An ancient artifact? And how can two cousins use the dangerous shadows to fight back against a small army? The truth changes everything. Comment your predictions. The gunshot was a starting pistol. The fragile piece was shattered. Silas didn't wait for Amelia's permission. He moved with a survivor's instinct, grabbing her arm and pulling her off the porch. Cellar. Now. It's the strongest place. Amelia. Her mind swimming with revelations of cursed bloodlines and corporate assassins, didn't argue. The shadows around the property seemed to writhe in agitation, churning like black water. They fled inside, down into the cold, earth-smelling darkness of the root cellar. Silas barred the heavy wooden door from the inside, plunging them into a silence broken only by their ragged breathing. A single lantern hung from a hook. Silas lit it, casting long dancing shadows that felt different from the ones outside, older, less menacing, more like memories. We can't fight them head-on, Silas stated, his voice calm but urgent. There are too many. Our only advantage is this land. We have to understand what we're dealing with. His eyes scanned the cramped cellar, filled with jars of preserves and sacks of grain. Your grandmother. She knew. She must have left something. Records, notes, anything. Amelia thought of her grandmother's stern, secretive face. She'd always been digging, always studying old papers late into the night. There's a trunk, she said, pointing to a corner obscured by cobwebs. She said never to open it. Together, they hauled the heavy, iron-bound chest into the circle of lantern light. The lock was rusted shut. Silas didn't hesitate. He used the butt of his revolver to smash it. The lid creaked open, releasing a smell of old paper and dust. Inside were not family heirlooms. It was an archive of madness. Neatly stacked journals, maps drawn on fragile parchment, and diagrams filled with alchemical symbols and frantic annotations. It was her grandmother's life's work. Silas grabbed the top journal, his eyes scanning the elegant, frantic script. She wasn't just containing it, he breathed, a look of awe on his face. She was studying it, trying to cure it. Amelia picked up a large map of the property. Overlaid on the familiar landmarks were swirling, concentric circles emanating from a point deep beneath the northern pasture. It wasn't a treasure map. It was a contamination map. Listen to this, Silas said, reading aloud. The Obscura is not a mineral, but a liquid memory. A remnant of a world before our own, seeping through a crack in the earth. It records emotion, amplifies it, gives it form. The violence of its unearthing poisoned the land with a permanent echo of fear and greed. He looked up, his stormy eyes wide. It's not a curse. It's a reflection, the shadows. They're made from our own family's darkest moments. Our great-grandfather's greed when he found it. The fear of those who took it. The paranoia that made my father flee and your grandmother lock herself away. The Obscura mirrors it all back at us. Amelia picked up another journal, her hands trembling. This one was newer, her grandmother's writing. The key is not to fight the shadows, but to change the reflection. The Obscura responds to strong, pure emotion. It cannot withstand selfless love. It cannot comprehend sacrificial courage. A single act of true light can disrupt the echo. For a time, create a safe passage. She looked at Silas, a dawning, terrifying understanding in her eyes. She's saying we can control it, not with weapons, but with feeling. Silas's face was grim. A nice thought. But Deacon and his men aren't going to try love. They're going to try dynamite. And if they blast open whatever's buried down there, he didn't need to finish. If the Obscura was a liquid memory of fear, unleashing it fully would drown the entire territory in a waking nightmare. He sifted through the papers until he found a specific schematic. It was a detailed drawing of the mining shaft their great-grandfather had dug the source. And there, in the margins, her grandmother had written a single desperate sentence. The Obscura seeks a conduit, a bloodline to anchor itself to the physical world. If both heirs are lost, it will be adrift, vulnerable. But if even one survives, the tether remains. The truth was more horrifying than they imagined. The corporation didn't just want the Obscura. They wanted to control it. And to do that, they didn't need to kill both heirs. They only needed to capture one. A heavy fist suddenly pounded on the cellar door above them. Deacon's voice, cold and mocking, filtered through the wood. "Come on out, folks. We know you're down there. Let's talk about your inheritance. The shadows are an echo of the family's own darkness made real. The corporation wants to capture one heir to control this power. Trapped in the cellar, how can Silas and Amelia possibly escape? Can they really use light and courage against bullets and dynamite? The danger is inside and outside. What's their next move? Comment your theories." Deacon's pounding fist on the cellar door was a death knell. The wood groaned under the assault. They had minutes, maybe seconds. The reflection. Amelia whispered, her grandmother's words crashing into the present danger. She said, "It responds to strong emotion." Silas's eyes were wild, scanning the cramped cellar for a weapon, an exit, anything. "I don't think my strong emotion of pure terror is going to help us right now." But Amelia's mind was racing, pieces of her lonely life here clicking into place. The shadows didn't just watch, they reacted. They grew agitated when she was angry, still when she was calm. Her grandmother hadn't just been studying the Obscura. She'd been training it, or herself, through a lifetime of rigid emotional control. Not terror, Amelia said, her voice gaining a sudden steel-like certainty. She grabbed the lantern. Rage. Before Silas could stop her, she turned the lantern's flame high and threw it not at the door, but at the far wall of the cellar, where the oldest, darkest shadows pooled in the crevices between the stones. Effect was instantaneous and explosive. The shadows didn't catch fire, they recoiled. They hissed like steam, pulling back from the light and heat, not as inert darkness, but as a living thing that had been burned. And in their violent retreat, they revealed what they had been clinging to for decades alow. Narrow opening in the stone foundation, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, disguised behind a rotted wooden panel. A bolt hole. Silas breathed. A splintering crash came from above. The cellar door was giving way. "Go!" Silas yelled, shoving Amelia toward the opening. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to her hands and knees and scrambled into the tight, earth-walled tunnel. Silas was right behind her, his larger frame scraping against the sides. They left the trunk and its secrets behind. The only sound now their frantic scrambling and the enraged shouts from the cellar they'd just escaped. The tunnel was short, angling sharply upward. It emerged behind a thicket of chaparral 50 yards from the house, well beyond the circle of light now emanating from the homestead's windows. They lay in the dirt, gasping, watching as Deacon's men swarmed the house. "They'll find the tunnel," Amelia panted. "But not before we're gone," Silas said. His gaze was fixed on the house, on the men tossing her belongings into the yard. A cold fury settled on his features. "They think they're hunters. They don't know this land is hunting them." He had a plan. It was reckless, born of a lifetime. On the run. The Obscura. It responds to strong emotion, right? To fear? Amelia nodded, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "Then let's give it a feast," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "Deacon wants to use dynamite? Let's show him where to plant it." He pointed toward the northern pasture, to the epicenter on her grandmother's map, the main shaft. "It's boarded up, but it's the weakest point. If they blow it, they'll think they're unleashing hell. But according to your grandmother's notes, they'll just be setting the shadows loose, unanchored. It'll be chaos. a storm of pure, amplified fear. And in that chaos, we run, Amelia finished, understanding the brutal genius of it. They couldn't win a fight, but they could unleash a bigger monster and hope it turned on their enemy's first dot. It was a gamble with their souls. They would be unleashing the concentrated darkness of their own bloodline onto the world. Silas looked at her, the question in his eyes. It was her land, her legacy, her choice from the house. A triumphant shout went up. They'd found the cellar tunnel. Amelia met her cousin's gaze, her own resolve hardening. Her grandmother had spent a lifetime containing the darkness. But sometimes to survive a predator, you had to let a bigger one off its leash. Let's go, she said. They moved like ghosts through the familiar terrain, using the natural cover and the growing unease of Deacon's men, who were already jumpy from the oppressive atmosphere, to their advantage. Silas, with a predator's skill, created a few distractions. A rock thrown into the distance, a faint whistle that sounded like a signal. He was hurting them, stoking their paranoia, feeding the land with their rising fear. They reached the old mine shaft, its entrance a scar in the earth sealed with heavy, rotten timbers. A warning sign, bleached and splintered by the sun, hung crookedly from a single nail. It was a place of palpable dread. Silas cupped his hands around his mouth and, from their hiding place, yelled in a panicked voice that carried on the still night air. "It's in the mine. He's hiding it in the mine." It was all Deacon needed. To hear. They watched as the men converged on the shaft, setting their charges with frantic efficiency. The fear was on them now, a tangible thing. The very air grew heavier, colder. The shadows around the mine entrance began to swirl, drawn to the intensity of the emotion like vultures. Deacon himself lit the fuse. The explosion was deafening. A pillar of fire and earth erupted into the sky, and for a split second, there was silence. Then, the screaming started. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of the earth itself screaming, a psychic wave of pure, undiluted terror that erupted from the blown-open shaft. The shadows coalesced into a roaring black tide, swallowing the men at the epicenter. Their shouts were cut off, not by death, but by madness, consumed by the amplified echoes of their own deepest fears. Silas grabbed Amelia's hand. "Now, while it's feeding." They turned to run, to flee into the desert, and never look back. But a figure emerged from the chaos, blocking their path. Deacon. He hadn't been at the mine. He'd been waiting for them. His face was smudged with soot, his eyes gleaming with a triumph that was entirely unhinged. He didn't raise his gun. He raised a strange metallic device that looked like a large, intricate compass. "I don't need the source," Deacon snarled, his voice cutting through the psychic wail. "The corporation just needs the key." He pointed the device at Amelia. It began to hum, and a piercing high-frequency whine cut through the air. The swirling shadows around her recoiled violently, repelled by the sound. "They learned a few things since your great-granddaddy's day," Deacon said, taking a step forward. The device was isolating her, creating a bubble of null space around her, separating her from the very force they had unleashed. "The bloodline is the tether," he said. "And you're coming with me." Deacon has a device that repels the shadows. He doesn't want to destroy the Obscura. He wants to isolate and capture Amelia to control it. With Silas unarmed and the shadows neutralized, how can they possibly stop him? The hunter becomes the hunted. What shocking twist will save them? Comment your predictions. The high-frequency whine from Deacon's device was a physical force, a nail driven into the skull. The roaring tide of shadows that had engulfed his men writhed and pulled back from Amelia as if she were white-hot, creating a perfect, terrifying circle of empty air around her. She was cut off, exposed, the tether now a leash for Deacon to take. "The bloodline is the tether," Deacon repeated, his voice dripping with vile triumph. "And you're coming with me." Silas stood frozen for a fraction of a second, his plan in ruins. The monster they had unleashed was useless against the cold, technological countermeasure. He was unarmed, and Deacon's free hand was resting on the pistol at his hip, but Silas hadn't survived this long by fighting fair. He didn't go for Deacon. He went for the ground, scooping up a handful of the dry, powdery earth. He lunged not at Deacon, but to the side, and threw the dirt directly at the strange humming device. It was a desperate, stupid, brilliant move. The fine dust clogged the device's delicate grills and emitter ports. The piercing whine stuttered, distorted into a grating, staticky cough. The bubble of null space flickered. For that single critical instant, the shadows rushed back in. They didn't attack Deacon. They weren't weapons. They were a force of nature. They reacted to the strongest emotion in the vicinity. And the strongest thing right then was not fear. It was Deacon's pure, incandescent rage at having his victory spoiled. The shadows, amplified by the raw obscura pouring from the blown mineshaft, latched onto that rage. They didn't consume him. They mirrored it. Deacon's eyes went wide, not with fear, but with an uncontrollable paranoid fury. He saw enemies everywhere. He saw Silas not as a man, but as a monstrous distortion. He saw his own men, who were stumbling and screaming in their own private hells, as traitors closing in on him. Get back! He roared, and he forgot all about Amelia and the device. He swung his pistol wildly and fired into the chaos at phantoms of his own amplified rage. The shot went wide, but it was the distraction they needed. The device. Amelia screamed at Silas. Silas was already moving. He tackled Deacon low and hard, not trying to win a fight, just trying to dislodge the machine from his grip. They crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust, the device flying from Deacon's hand and skittering across the hard-packed earth. Amelia dove for it. Her hands closed around the cold metal. It was still humming, its light blinking erratically. She had no idea how to use it, how to turn it off. She could only do the obvious thing. She raised it high above her head and smashed it down onto a nearby rock with all her strength. The casing cracked. The lights died. The horrible whining ceased. The silence that followed was brief and absolute. And then the shadows no longer repelled, no longer focused solely on Deacon's rage, rushed in to feed on the entire buffet of fear, anger, and pain that filled the clearing. It was bedlam. Deacon's remaining men were lost, shooting at illusions, running blindly into the desert. Deacon himself was on his knees, clutching his head, screaming at things only he could see. Silas scrambled to his feet, grabbing Amelia's arm. The horses, now! They ran through the nightmare. Shadows brushed against them, and for Amelia, it was like being touched by every lonely, fearful night she had ever spent on this land. She felt her grandmother's grief, her great-grandfather's greed, Silas's father's terror. It was a tsunami of family pain. They found the marshal's horses tethered 100 yards away, spooked and rearing. Silas calmed one with a surprisingly gentle hand, cutting it free. He all but threw Amelia into the saddle and mounted another. A single gunshot rang out. Deacon stood, swaying, his face a mask of utter madness, his pistol aimed at them. But the shot was wild, pulled wide by the horrors in his mind. They didn't wait for a second one. They kicked the horses into a gallop and fled into the welcoming darkness of the open desert, leaving the cursed land and its amplified nightmares behind. They rode for an hour until the horses were lathered, and the sounds of chaos were far behind them. Finally they slowed, gulping in the clean, cold air of the desert night. Amelia looked back the way they had come. The Blackwood land was just a dark smudge on the horizon, but she could still feel the echo of the shadows, a cold spot in her soul. It's over, she whispered, the words feeling like a lie. Silas shook his head, his expression grim in the moonlight. No, it's not. Deacon might be broken, but the corporation isn't. They know what we are now. They know what the Obscura can do. They'll send others, with better devices. He looked at her, his cousin, his only family. The world now knows our family's secret, and we can never go home again. They escaped, but the corporation now knows the Obscura is real and powerful. Where can they possibly go that the corporation won't find them? Is there a way to truly destroy the Obscura for good? Or will they be hunted forever? The adventure continues, but the rules have changed. What's their next move? Comment your predictions. The vastness of the desert was both a prison and their only salvation. They rode through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the nightmare at the Blackwood Ranch. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken truth. They were fugitives from an enemy they couldn't see, tied to a curse they couldn't escape. As dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, they found shelter in a shallow canyon, hidden from view. The horses were exhausted, their heads drooping. Amelia and Silas slid from their saddles, their own bodies aching with fatigue and adrenaline crash. "It's not enough to just run," Amelia said, her voice hoarse. Her hands were still shaking. She could still feel the cold grip of the shadows, the psychic scream of the Obscura. "They'll find us. You said it yourself. We have to end this." Silas was checking their meager supplies, a canteen, a few strips of jerky, the clothes on their backs. He looked up, his stormy eyes shadowed. "End it how? We can't fight a corporation. We can't kill a liquid memory." Grandmother's journals, Amelia insisted, the memory of the trunk surfacing through the panic. She wasn't just studying it. She was looking for a cure. She wrote about changing the reflection. "There has to be an answer there. We have to go back." Silas stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Back? Amelia, Deacon, and whatever's left of his men are probably still there, lost in their own private hells. The place is crawling with whatever we unleashed." "Not to the house," she said, her mind racing, piecing together fragments from the maps and journals. "The source, the main shaft. We blew it open, but we didn't go down there." Grandmother's notes, she mentioned a heartstone, a focal point. She believed if it could be shattered, the Obscura would lose its anchor to this world, that it would dissipate back into the earth. It wouldn't be a cure for what's already been poisoned, but it would stop it from growing. It would break the tether for good. She saw the doubt on his face. It was a theory, a desperate hope scribbled in the margins of a mad woman's journal. "What choice do we have, Silas?" She pressed, her voice desperate. "Run until we're old and gray, looking over our shoulders every minute? Wait for them to come for us with a better machine? Or go back now, while the chaos we created is still our cover, and try to finish what our grandmother started?" She could see the calculation in his eyes, the lifetime of running warring with the faint, terrifying hope of a final stand. He was silent for a long time, watching the sun climb over the canyon rim. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath. "If we do this, it's not a fight, it's a raid, in and out. We get to the Heartstone, we break it, we leave. We don't engage. We don't try to be heroes." Amelia nodded, a wave of relief and fresh terror washing over her. In and out. They spent the day resting in the sweltering heat of the canyon, taking turns keeping watch. As evening fell, they mounted up and began the long, cautious ride back toward the nightmare. The approach was different this time. They left the horses a mile out, tethered in a dry wash, and continued on foot. The air grew colder as they neared the property line, the familiar dread settling over them like a shroud dot from a ridge. They looked down on the ranch. It was a scene of utter desolation. The house stood dark and silent. 2 bodies lay in the yard, unmoving. There was no sign of Deacon or the other men. The blown open mine shaft was a black scar in the earth, weeping a visible dark haze that shimmered under the moonlight. The shadows were thicker than ever, swirling like a lazy, malevolent fog. "It's quieter," Silas whispered. "The screaming. It's stopped." "Maybe they're all dead," Amelia said, though the thought brought no comfort. "Or maybe the Obscura has finished." "With them," Silas replied grimly, using the coverage of the agitated shadows and the terrain. They moved like ghosts, circling wide around the house and heading straight for the mine. The entrance was a jagged maw of splintered timber and shattered rock. The air coming from it was frigid and carried a metallic taste that made their teeth ache. Silas lit a small lantern he'd taken from his saddlebag. "Ready?" Amelia nodded, her heart in her throat. Together, they stepped into the darkness. The descent was steep and treacherous. The tunnel was not man-made. It was a natural fissure that their great-grandfather had widened. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, and seeped with a dark, viscous fluid that seemed to absorb the lantern light, the Obscura. The deeper they went, the heavier the pressure became. It was a physical weight, a psychic assault. Whispers echoed. In the tunnel, not in their ears, but in their minds, fragments of arguments, of panicked shouts, of their ancestors' greed and fear. "Claim it all for ourselves. It's watching us. Run. For God's sake, run." Amelia clutched her head, trying to block it out. Silas's jaw was clenched, his face pale and sheened with sweat. They pressed on, driven by a desperate need to end this. The tunnel opened into a cavern. And there, in the center, was the Heartstone. It was not a stone. It was a massive, pulsating geode of pure obsidian, but it throbbed with an inner, sickly light. It was beautiful and horrifying. Tendrils of the dark liquid seeped from it, running in rivulets down into the earth. This was the crack. This was the source. And kneeling before it, one hand pressed against its dark surface, was Deacon. He was alive, but he was ruined. His eyes were vacant, his face slack. He was muttering incoherently, trapped in a waking nightmare, a permanent conduit for the Obscura's poison. "He's the anchor now," Silas breathed in horror. "The Obscura is using him. It's keeping him alive, to sustain itself." Amelia looked from Deacon to the Heartstone. Her grandmother's words were clear: shatter the Heartstone. But as she hefted a large, heavy piece of rubble from the tunnel wall, ready to charge forward, Deacon's vacant eyes suddenly focused. Not on her, on something behind them. A smooth, calm voice echoed through the cavern. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. The stabilization process is very delicate." They turned. Standing at the tunnel entrance were three figures in pristine, modern, tactical gear, utterly out of place. The man in front held a device similar to Deacon's, but smaller, more advanced. It emitted a soft, neutralizing hum that pushed the shadows back, creating a bubble of sterile calm around them. He smiled. A cold, corporate smile. "Miss Blackwood, Mr. Rook, so good of you to lead us to the epicenter. We'll take it from here." The corporate operative's smile was a scalpel, cold and precise. The advanced device in his hand didn't just repel the shadows. It silenced them, creating a jarring pocket of dead air in the psychic storm of the cavern. The whispers in there. Minds cut off abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise. Stabilization? Amelia's voice was a rasp, the heavy rock in her hand feeling useless against their polished technology. "Of course," the lead operative said, his tone that of a professor addressing slow children. He gestured with his free hand toward Deacon, who was now catatonic once more, his hand fused to the pulsating Heartstone. "The subject has served his purpose. A crude but effective temporary measure." He amplified the signal, allowing us to pinpoint the location. "But this," he looked at the Heartstone with naked greed, "this requires finesse, not dynamite." Silas took a half step in front of Amelia, his body coiled like a spring. "You'll never control it. Control is such a primitive concept. the man replied, his smile never fading. "We don't wish to control it, we wish to harvest it. This Obscura is a quantum-recorded emotional energy source of unimaginable potency. Weaponized anxiety, marketable fear. The applications are boundless." He nodded to the two other operatives. They moved forward, not with guns drawn, but with strange, glove-like devices on their hands that crackled with a faint blue energy. "The bloodlines are the key," the leader continued. "Your unique resonance allows you to interface with the source without being immediately consumed. You will be invaluable assets, willingly or not." The operatives fanned out. The message was clear: come quietly or be taken by force. Amelia's mind raced. Fighting was useless. Their technology neutralized everything. Her grandmother's notes: "It cannot withstand selfless love. It cannot comprehend sacrificial courage." It was a philosophy, not a strategy. But what if it was both? The leader's device created a bubble of null space, but it was focused forward, on the Heartstone, on them. It was a shield, not a sphere. She looked at Silas, a desperate, unspoken question in her eyes. He gave a barely perceptible nod. They had no plan, only trust. As the lead operative took another step, Amelia didn't raise her rock to throw it. She did something utterly inexplicable. She turned her back on the armed advanced threat, and she ran. But not for the exit. She ran straight for Deacon. For the Heartstone. "Amelia, no." Silas yelled, the panic in his voice real and raw. The lead operative's smile finally vanished, replaced by confusion. "Stop her! She disrupts the equilibrium." The two other operatives lunged, but Silas moved on pure instinct, tackling one of them to the ground. It was a chaotic, stumbling fight, a brawl against superior training. Amelia reached Deacon. The man was a shell, his mind utterly gone, his body a living battery for the Obscura. She didn't try to pull him away. She did the opposite. She dropped the rock and placed her own hands directly on the Heartstone, on either side of Deacon's lifeless hand. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The operative's null field device was designed to handle the ambient output of the Obscura, to repel its manifestations. It was not designed for the raw, undiluted power of the source itself, channeled directly through a bloodline air. The moment Amelia touched the stone, the cavern erupted. The psychic scream returned, multiplied 1,000-fold. It wasn't just fear and rage anymore. It was every emotion stored in the stone: her grandmother's love for the land, her great-grandfather's ambition, Silas's father's despair, her own loneliness. A tsunami of raw, conflicting energy exploded outward. The lead operative's device overloaded with a sharp crack, its lights dying. The bubble of silence popped. The shadows, no longer suppressed, rushed in, but they were no longer formless. They were memories. Phantoms of the past flickered through the cavern: a laughing couple, her grandparents, a man fleeing in terror, Silas's father, a greedy face staring into the depths, her great-grandfather. The two operatives, including the one fighting Silas, recoiled, clutching their heads. Their advanced gloves were useless against a direct assault on their senses. They were overwhelmed, screaming as the concentrated history of the Blackwood and Rook families poured into their minds. The lead operative stumbled backward, his cool composure shattered, his hands over his ears. "The data! It's too much! Abort! Abort!" But Amelia wasn't done. The energy was tearing her apart. She could feel her own mind fraying at the edges. But she held on. She focused not on the darkness, but on the one pure thing she could find in the maelstrom. She looked at Silas, her cousin, the only family she had left. She focused on a single, powerful emotion. Not love, not yet, but acceptance, protection. A selfless, desperate need for him to survive this. The Obscura, the great mirror, reacted. It couldn't comprehend it. It couldn't reflect it. The chaotic storm of energy wavered, stuttered, For a split second, the conflicting echoes of fear and greed were disrupted. Overwhelmed by something alien to its nature, in that moment of disruption, the Heartstone, the unstable focal point of it all, could take no more. A web of cracks appeared. On its dark surface, with a sound like breaking ice, Silas, seeing his chance, threw off the disoriented operative and grabbed Amelia, yanking her away from the stone just as it shattered. There was no explosion. There was a release. A deep, final sigh that seemed to come from the earth itself. The pulsating light within the geode died. The tendrils of black liquid flowing from it solidified into brittle, inert crystal. The whispering stopped. The shadows in the cavern didn't vanish, but they faded, becoming mere shadows again, devoid of sentient malice. The cavern was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the survivors. The three operatives were on their knees, broken, not physically, but mentally. The lead operative stared blankly at his ruined device, muttering about irreplaceable data. The Heartstone was dead. The source was closed. Amelia slumped against Silas, trembling violently. The connection was severed. The tether was broken. They had won. They had sacrificed their home, their history, and a part of their own sanity, but they had won. Silas helped her to her feet. They didn't look back at the ruined operatives or the catatonic deacon. They stumbled out of the mine into the cold, clean desert air. The land was still poisoned. The shadows would likely linger for generations, but the bleeding had stopped. The wound was sealed. They were free, and they were alone in the world, with nothing but each other and the ghost of a legacy they had finally laid to rest. The Heartstone is shattered. The Obscura's source is sealed. But the corporate operatives are still alive, though broken. What will they report to their powerful company? Is the threat truly over? Or has Amelia and Silas just made an even more powerful, vengeful enemy? The immediate danger is gone, but what new storm is on the horizon? Comment your predictions for the future. The silence in the cavern was absolute. It was the silence of an extinguished star, deep and empty. The oppressive weight was gone. The whispers had ceased. The Heartstone was no longer a pulsating wound in the earth, but a pile of dull black. Crystal and rubble, the Obscura hadn't vanished. It had been neutralized, its connection to the world above severed. The land would bear the scar, but the bleeding had stopped. Amelia leaned heavily against Silas, her body trembling from the psychic backlash. Her mind felt raw, scoured clean by the torrent of ancestral emotion. Silas held her up, his own breathing ragged, his eyes fixed on the three broken figures across the cavern. The corporate operatives were on their knees. The two grunts rocked back and forth, their hands clamped over their ears, their eyes wide with a terror that was now entirely their own. The lead operative, the man with the cold smile, was different. He wasn't catatonic with fear. He was meticulously gathering the pieces of his shattered device, his movements slow, precise, and utterly chilling. He was cataloging the failure. He looked up, and his eyes met Silas's. There was no fear in them, no anger, only a cold, calculating assessment. He saw them not as people, but as variables in a failed equation. Variables that had just destroyed a priceless asset. "They'll come for you, you know," the man said, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of its earlier smugness, but filled with a new, grim certainty. Not for the Obscura, not anymore. For the data. For the insult. The corporation does not tolerate loss. And you are a walking, talking report on how not to handle an E1 classified asset. He slowly, painfully got to his feet, still clutching the broken components. You haven't won. You've just changed the game. And you have no idea what the new rules are. He didn't try to stop them. He simply turned and began helping his disoriented men to their feet, a general retreating from a lost battle to plan the war. Silas felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the Obscura. The man was right. They hadn't defeated the enemy. They had made it personal. "Let's go," he muttered to Amelia, his voice tight. They stumbled out of the mine, leaving the ruins of their legacy behind. The desert air had never tasted so clean, so free. But the freedom felt fragile, borrowed. They found their horses and rode. They didn't stop until the sun was high in the sky, putting countless miles of empty desert between them and the Blackwood. Ranch Dot in the shelter of a red rock mesa, they finally dismounted. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. "What now?" Amelia asked, her voice small. The question hung in the air, vast and unanswerable as the desert itself. They were two people with nothing, no home, no money, no past they could safely claim. Silas was silent for a long time, staring out at the endless horizon. The lifetime of running had prepared him for this, but the goal had always been vague: survive. Now survival had a new, more complicated meaning. "We can't just disappear," he said finally. "Men like that, they don't find people by looking. They find people by predicting them. They'll have profiles. They'll know our skills, our tendencies. They'll expect us to run to a city, to lose ourselves in a crowd." A slow, determined light began to kindle in his stormy eyes. It was the same look he'd had when he decided to use the shadows against Deacon. "So we don't run where they expect," he said, a plan forming in the ashes of their old life. "We use the only advantage we have left." Amelia looked at him, confused. "What advantage? We have nothing." "We have the truth," Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. "And we have a story. A story about a corrupt corporation, murdered U.S. Marshals, and a supernatural weapon they tried to steal. A story too big, too crazy, too dangerous for them to let get out." He turned to her, his expression fierce. "We find the newspaper. A big one. In a town big enough that we can get lost for a day, but not so big that their eyes are everywhere. We talk to a reporter. We give them everything. The names, the company, what they did, what they wanted." Amelia stared at him, stunned by the key. "Audacity. They'll kill us before we ever see a printing press." "Maybe," Silas admitted, "but it's a different kind of fight. Right now we're prey. If we talk, we become a liability. A public liability is much harder to make disappear than two nobodies in the desert. It's a shield made of ink instead of iron." It was a desperate gamble. It was putting a target on their backs in the most public way imaginable. But it was also a fight back. It was using the corporation's own fear, the fear of exposure, against them. "We take control of the narrative," Amelia whispered, understanding dawning. She thought of her grandmother's words, changed the reflection. This was how they changed. They wouldn't hide in fear. They would shine the brightest light they could find on the monsters hunting them. "Exactly," Silas said. "We head north. To Santa Fe. It's got telegraph lines, a major newspaper. We tell our story, all of it. And then we vanish again, deeper than before, and we let the story do the fighting for us." It was a plan born of equal parts brilliance and desperation. They would trade the silence of hiding for the protection of a spotlight. They would become ghosts, but ghosts that everyone was talking about. They mounted up once more, but this time they weren't running blindly. They were riding toward something. Toward a reckoning. The corporation had technology and money, but Amelia and Silas had the only thing more powerful than a weaponized nightmare. A truth that could start a fire nothing could put out. Their new plan is to go public with the whole incredible story. Will any newspaper believe them? Can they even make it to Santa Fe without being intercepted? And if they succeed, will the publicity protect them, or just make the corporation want to silence them faster? The stakes are higher than ever. What will happen in Santa Fe? Comment your predictions. The ride to Santa Fe was a journey through a world that felt suddenly ordinary. The desert bloomed with spring flowers, the sun was warm, and the skies were clear. The normalcy was jarring, a stark contrast to the psychic war they had just survived. Every distant rider, every stagecoach that passed them on the well-traveled road, sent a jolt of fear through them. They were exposed, two specks moving toward the one place their hunters might expect desperate people to go. Civilization. They reached the outskirts of the city 3 days later, dusty, exhausted, and penniless. Santa Fe was a bustling territory. Capital, a mix of adobe buildings and newer wooden structures, teeming with people from all walks of life. They left their tired horses at a livery stable, offering the last of Silas's hidden money, sewn into his boot heel as payment, and melted into the crowded streets. Their target was the Santa Fe Sentinel, the largest newspaper in the territory. They found it on a busy street, its windows filled with printed headlines about mining disputes and territorial politics. It looked solid, real, a bastion of the mundane world they were about to shatter. For a long moment, they stood across the street, watching the comings and goings. Reporters with ink-stained fingers, businessmen with stern expressions. It felt like preparing to jump off a cliff. "Are you sure about this?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll think we're mad." "Maybe," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the door. "But we're not lying. We have the truth. And sometimes the truth is crazier than any lie." He took a deep breath and stepped off the boardwalk. Amelia followed, her heart hammering against. Her ribs. The inside of the newspaper office was a chaotic symphony of clacking typewriters, ringing telephones, and the sharp smell of ink and paper. A young clerk looked up from his desk, his expression bored. "Can I help you?" "We need to speak to the editor," Silas said, his voice firm, cutting through the noise. "It's urgent. It's about the murder of U.S. Marshals and a corporate conspiracy." The clerk's boredom evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed shock. He stammered, "One moment, sir," and scurried away into a glass-walled office at the back of the room. A moment later, a man emerged. He was in his 50s with a shrewd face, spectacles perched on his nose, and a vest stained with what looked like coffee. He looked them up and down, taking in their trail-worn clothes and desperate eyes. "I'm editor Josiah Pierce. My boy says you have quite a story." "We do," Amelia said, finding her voice. "And you're the only one who can help us." "Tell it." Pierce studied them for a long moment, then gestured to his office. "Come in, you have 5 minutes." They followed him in and sat in hard wooden chairs. And they talked. They started with the 10 false marshals, the name Deacon, the locket, the family history. They spoke of the shadows, the obscura, the heartstone, and the corporate operatives. With their null-field devices, they held nothing back. It was a torrent of unbelievable truth. Pierce listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When they finished, the office was quiet. He removed his spectacles and polished them slowly. "That," he said finally, "is the most spectacular piece of fiction I have heard since the penny dreadful about the vampire cattle rustler." Amelia's heart sank. "It's not fiction." "I believe you believe it," Pierce said, not unkindly. "But a newspaper prints facts, evidence. You have none. You speak of a liquid memory and shattered geodes. You have no bodies, no badges, no proof of this corporation." He sighed. "If I print this, I'll be the laughingstock of the territory. And you'll be in a jail cell for wasting my time or in an asylum for your own safety." It was over. They had risked everything for nothing. The plan had been a fantasy, but as they stood to leave, defeated, Silas made one last desperate move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only physical piece of evidence they had. It was a twisted, blackened shard of metal, its internal wiring exposed. "This was part of their device," Silas said, placing it on Pierce's desk. "The one that silenced the shadows. It's like nothing any blacksmith or tinker in this territory has ever made. Look at it." Pierce picked up the shard. He turned it over in his hands. His bored expression slowly changed to one of intense curiosity. He was a man who knew the look of things, and this piece of technology was utterly alien. And you said the leader. He was gathering the pieces, Pierce murmured, more to himself than to them. He didn't care about you. He cared about the technology. He looked up at them, a new light in his eyes. The light of a newsman who smelled a story, not of monsters, but of men. This corporation, Pierce said, his voice low and serious. What was its name? Did you ever hear a name? Amelia and Silas looked at each other. They hadn't. It had always been a faceless, nameless evil. But then, Amelia remembered. A single word, muttered by the lead operative in the cavern amidst the chaos. A word she'd thought was nonsense. Nexus, she said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. I think he said Nexus. Editor Pierce's face went pale. All traces of skepticism vanished, replaced by stark, genuine fear. Nexus. Syndicate, he breathed, the name a curse. He stood up quickly and closed his office door, shutting out the noise of the newsroom. He turned back to them, his demeanor completely changed. You need to leave, now. Forget you ever came here. Forget you ever heard that name. What is it? Silas demanded. Who are they? They are not a company you expose in a newspaper, Pierce said, his voice urgent. They are the string pullers. They own railroads, mines, politicians. If they are involved in this, then you are already dead. You walking in here didn't make you a liability. It made you a target standing in my office. Their public shield had just become their death warrant. They hadn't found a protector. They had led the wolf to a new door. The editor knows the name Nexus Syndicate and is terrified. Their plan to go public has backfired spectacularly. Now the newspaper itself might be in danger. How can they possibly get out of Santa Fe alive? Is the editor potential ally, or will he hand them over to save himself? The walls are closing in. What happens next? Comment your predictions. Editor Pierce's fear was a cold wave that washed over the small office, extinguishing the last flicker of hope. The name Nexus Syndicate wasn't just a company. It was a death sentence. You have to understand, Pierce whispered, his voice trembling as he peered through the blinds into the bustling street. They don't send men with guns. They send lawyers with writs and accountants with ledgers. They bury you in paperwork and lawsuits until you cease to exist. Or, he added, his eyes darting back to them, they make you disappear for real. Now get out. Get out of my city. But it was too late. Silas, his senses honed by a life on the run, held up a hand for silence. He pointed toward the front window. Two well-dressed men in long coats, who looked utterly out of place among the dusty locals, were posted across the street, their eyes systematically scanning the crowd. They weren't looking for anyone. They were waiting. They had already cordoned off the area. They're here, Silas said, his voice flat. They must have been watching all the major papers, waiting for us to show up. Panic flashed in Pierce's eyes. If they were found in his office, his newspaper, his life's work, would be ash by morning. He was a pragmatist. His fear for them was now secondary to his fear for himself. Amelia saw the calculation on his face. You can't hand us over, she pleaded. You're a newsman. You have a duty to the truth. The truth gets people killed. Pierce shot back, but the conflict was tearing him apart. He believed them now, and that belief terrified him more than anything. An idea, desperate and born of the same instinct that had let her manipulate the shadows, sparked in Amelia's mind. She didn't appeal to his courage. She appealed to his self-interest. If you help us, you don't just have a story, she said, her words rapid and intense. You have the story of a lifetime. The story that breaks the Nexus Syndicate. But if they take us in your office, you're just another loose end they silence. Help us escape, and you live. And you get everything. The evidence, our testimony, the whole truth. You become the most famous editor in America. She was offering him a prize too great to ignore. Not just survival, but legacy. Pierce stared at her, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked at the strange tech chart on his desk, then out the window at the Nexus Sentinels. The gamble was monumental. Damn you, he muttered. Then he moved. Follow me, quickly. He led them not to the front door, but through the chaotic newsroom to a back storage closet filled with rolls of newsprint and ink barrels. He shoved a heavy shelf aside, revealing a low door hidden in the adobe wall. Old delivery route from when the building was a trading post, he grunted. Comes out in the alley behind the cantina. Go left, then right at the end. It'll take you to the old mission. Lose yourselves there. Don't stop running. He thrust a small folded wad of bills into Silas's hand. For a horse. Don't ever come back here. As Silas pried the old door open, Pierce grabbed Amelia's arm. The story, he hissed. How do I get it? Amelia met his gaze. You don't. We'll find a way to get it to you when it's safe. Stay ready. They slipped into the dank, dark passageway just as the bell on the newspaper's front door jingled. Raised, official-sounding voices echoed from the main office. Nexus had arrived. They ran through the tight tunnel, emerging into a filthy alley reeking of garbage and urine. They followed Pierce's directions, sticking to the shadows, their hearts pounding. They heard shouts behind them. The pursuit had begun. They burst out onto a slightly wider street. The old mission was in sight, its bell tower a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. But standing between them and the mission were two more of the well-dressed Nexus men. They had anticipated the route, trapped, again, suddenly. From a doorway across the street, a lantern flared to life, held high. It was Editor Pierce. He didn't look at them. He pointed down a side alley opposite the Nexus men and yelled at the top of his lungs. They went that way, after them. The Nexus agents, startled by the shout and the sudden light, turned toward the sound and the indicated alley. It was only a second of distraction, but it was enough. Silas and Amelia didn't hesitate. They ran straight for the mission, vanishing into its dark courtyard as the sounds of confused pursuit echoed behind them. They didn't stop. They found a gate on the other side and kept running through the silent, sleeping city until they found the livery stable. With Pierce's money, they bought one fast horse and rode out of Santa Fe as the sun began to rise. Not as triumphant whistleblowers, but as fugitives once more. But they were fugitives with a purpose. They had an ally, however reluctant. They had a promise to keep. And they had a story that the most powerful entity in the country was terrified to see told. They rode east, toward the rising sun, toward an uncertain future, but one they would now face together, no longer defined by the shadows of their past, but by the light of the truth they carried.